About supercharging your PhoneGap workflow. So I'm looking forward to this. Let's see how it goes.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Actually, excuse me, Steve? Barbara, one second. So developing complex and sustainable PhoneGap apps can present many challenges. As your app grows, a seamless development workflow is crucial. Can you efficiently test and deploy in different environments? What are your pain points when implementing new functionality? And how can you organize all of the facets of your app with minimal effort? My name is Eric. I'm a software engineer and designer from the Bay Area, and I've been making software for over 12 years now and developing PhoneGap apps for the last 4. When I was developing a travel app on PhoneGap called Multu, I was faced with many workflow challenges. For this project, my co-founder Amber presented me with the question of, why do we have to book each hotel stay one at a time when traveling to multiple places? She decided to solve this problem with the idea of a purpose-driven route planner with the ability to search and book hotels for all of your upcoming trips in one go. So, overcoming the development hurdles while building Multu came down to a few main topics. Thinking about scaling. Like most projects at the beginning of developing Multu, scaling wasn't the first thing on my mind, especially considering the multitude of startup tasks and development decisions I was faced with. But scaling doesn't just apply to apps that have millions of users and growth challenges. Reframing the idea of scaling to consider the benefits it can have on your code base, workflow, and overall agility in making changes to your app are just a few of the positive side effects. For me, reframing the idea of scaling meant it kept me writing clean and maintainable code. So when thinking about the future of your code base and how it will scale, it's essential to write code you won't be afraid to come back to down the road to improve upon or change depending on how your app is growing and evolving. It also made it conducive to document and comment my code during development. While it may be great to go on a weekend bender and produce thousands of lines of code, if it's code you come back to in a few weeks later and not know what's going on, then that brief moment of productivity may be more harmful than good. So commenting my code, making notes for myself along the way were great mental markers. So finding ways to automatically organize my development process was also essential. It became a prerequisite for the mindset of completing new feature cycles efficiently and shipping updates often. And organizing my process consisted of many things, such as seeking out new tools that could help me automate menial tasks and correcting any bad habits I might have gotten into, and just not getting hung up on everyday development decisions. With what seemed like never-ending iterations of design and functionality, having the agility to shift and reprioritize my workload was essential in helping me refine all facets of the app. For each segment of functionality that Multu is comprised of, I was faced with the choice of using readily available frameworks or libraries versus writing custom code. And here's how I compared both approaches and making quick decisions. So with frameworks, they're readily available. They usually do most of what you need. They're tested and production ready for the most part. But some of the drawbacks is they might not do exactly what you need, and it may be difficult to customize or change parts of the functionality for exactly what you want. And it could require separate maintenance. So if it relies on a framework like jQuery or Zepto, and you upgrade that framework, Your libraries that depend on that might need to be updated as well if an update is available for it. Alternatively, writing custom code gives you total control. It'll do exactly what you need, and it's adaptable to your growing and changing app because it's part of your code base. But it requires dev time and planning, and it does add just more to your testing workload and things you have to consider when testing. So there are compromises to be had with each approach, but the winning strategy for me when deciding between custom versus ready-made solutions was when mapping out what I needed to build, I always looked at the development time required to implement either of the approaches in context of my total workload. So making educated decisions on time commitments for either approach helped give me clarity on how I should prioritize my overall dev time and what compromises I'd be willing to make for the sake of progress. So while an amazing benefit of PhoneGap apps is the ability to readily consume and work with web APIs, it can be a slippery slope when taking on too much overhead on the device itself for operations like data processing, formatting content. For example, the bulk of the content I was working with was data-rich hotel inventory. So what started as an attempt to pull and format this data directly on the device in JavaScript from what was a web API, it quickly made me realize the incredible performance drawbacks. So from there, I transitioned into developing a backend API server for myself. And for a short while, a small Node app acted as this middleman, backend API, which took care of a lot of heavy lifting. So from that point, it grew into a full Ruby on Rails application, which is what it is today. But the point is, how I escalated from a simple to complex backend was a fairly natural process. I kept considering the data I was working with and the extent that I needed to manipulate it. And the first step was just to consider creating a backend API for myself that would prepare, format, and just serve my app exactly the data that it needed to display in the UI. Then it was on to deciding how complex of a backend was needed. After all, a backend can range from a simple Node server or PHP scripts or even a full-blown Rails or Python app, for example. I mean, backend as a service tools are also good options for those looking for more of a drop-in API-based solution. But either way, I believe almost every app can benefit from having a backend API in some form. I mean, to consume and prepare any third-party APIs you may be using, to handle cloud syncing, or at the very least, to just offload any resource-intensive tasks that you might be running on the device. So not realizing how much time I spent doing simple tasks quickly became a black hole in my workflow. It sucked in 5 minutes here for fixing trivial syntax errors discovered only after I compiled my app, or 10 minutes there for doing all the tasks needed to get my app production ready. So in general, I fell victim at times to typing in just way too many commands in the command line at the end of the day and switching between emulators and devices in almost an erratic fashion for testing. So it doesn't have to be this way though. Finding opportunities for automation was as simple as making a list of all the tasks I do in my everyday developing, not leaving anything out, big or small. So I included everything such as the steps in the process I went through when adding new screens or features, and what steps I took when integrating a new tool or library. Next, I looked at every item in my list of tasks to determine if I could automate certain groups of items. So for example, when adding a new screen or feature, keeping a tidy organizational pattern for my code base and files helped streamline this process. I knew exactly where files needed to go and how to hook them into my code base instantly. I started using tools like Bower to download all the files for JavaScript libraries I needed to integrate and store them right in my app's asset directory automatically. So even Bower continues to help me keep these libraries up to date by downloading updates after running just a single shell command. Finally, I wrapped up most of these automation strategies into a task runner to help take my automation to the next level. And I'll talk more about using task runners shortly. The last area I really improved upon after analyzing my own workflow was production cleanup. So it was a realization that all of the performance engineering I would typically do for web apps before launching almost seamlessly applies to PhoneGap apps. I mean, this can include setting up different environments for my app, such as production, development, testing, and creating a completely separate production version of my code base. It could be minifying, concatenating assets, optimizing images, and deleting all dev-related files and folders before getting my app ready for shipping. Ultimately, the lesson learned was that it'll be a lot more work and nuance in the beginning to implement good practices, but you'll definitely thank yourself later. Next, I want to talk about some workflow do's and don'ts. Testing today for a better tomorrow is basically not delaying device testing. I mean, I promise bugs will find you in new and inventive ways that you can't even imagine. And there are many ways to debug poorly. And some of these are thinking your app is just a website. I mean, while it's great to use a browser to prototype and develop parts of your app, you can miss out on a lot that your app relies on if you use some of the PhoneGap device APIs. And this is obvious to those who are relying on geolocation or photos. But for those who aren't, even nuances such as a device with no network connectivity or not correctly handling or utilizing global event listeners can be the source of hidden bugs if not dealt with accordingly. But at the end of the day, we are all just building websites here. So utilizing amazing tools like Chrome's developer tools, Safari Web Inspector, can take you a far way in regards to rapidly developing the structure and UI of your app. And it can also help you just work through basic JavaScript-related issues and even profiling your app's performance. So you don't want to miss out on those. But ultimately, no app is safe from being concerned about how it's going to perform on actual devices. So I would just use your better judgment and start testing on as many real devices as you can as soon as you can. And alternatively, there are a lot of ways to debug really well. You can take advantage of those browser-based tools we just mentioned. You can consider remote debugging tools that allow you to basically use web inspector tools while testing on actual devices. So after spending more time than I'll ever publicly admit trying to get BDD testing working on my app, I think it's a landscape that's steadily improving with tools like Calabash and Cucumber. It's definitely worth considering doing some behavior-driven testing for your app if you have the time to experiment with implementing that. And the documentation is also getting a lot better as well. So as your app grows, it's harder to mentally grasp your entire app's code base. So splitting it up into manageable chunks can really help. A question you can ask yourself is, would you rather have a few files with 5,000 lines of code each, or have many files with a few hundred lines of code each? I mean, having a few files with 5,000 lines of code each, there's nothing technically wrong with this option. I mean, you can even use some sweet ASCII comment blocks to separate your giant chunks of code. But having a few files with 1,000 lines of code can make it difficult to know where things in your app are, and it often has you glued to Command F shortcut to try and find what you're looking for constantly. So opting to split up your files into smaller chunks is an all-around more sustainable solution. I mean, you can segment every piece of functionality into bite-sized files and name them by screen, by feature, keeping the naming consistent so you have, say, a dashboard.css file with the corresponding dashboard.js file and template file. And this is just a small example and can be further extrapolated for your needs. But ultimately, the key to building sustainable organization patterns, at least for me, is to hyper-componentize all of the code in my app, which basically means making self-contained modules out of every feature and part of the app so it creates a reusable and extendable pieces of code. So, though I err on the side of custom building large portions of my code for my projects, I'm a huge proponent of open source tools and the incredible power of the open source community. But it's important to keep in mind that there is a balance to be had when it comes to open source overhead. And it's eventual impact on your app's performance and workflow. So some guidelines I like to follow when choosing what open source tools would work best for my needs are choosing libraries that are mobile first. It's an obvious first step, but it should definitely be one of your first markers when picking a library or tool. You want to look out for things like touch support, mobile browser compatibility, and just that the entire package is small in file size. Also be on the lookout for tools that may require other dependencies. I mean, this could easily add more overhead to your app, and there could be a lightweight alternative if you keep, searching. And finding tools that can do more than one job for you is an excellent way to consolidate your resources. For example, you can get a lot out of using a toolkit like MobiScroll, where you can pick and choose the components you need, yet it's packaged into a single JS CSS file, so keeping your overhead really low. So, though one of the main attractions of PhoneGap may be the fact that you don't have to worry about messing with any scary native coding languages like Swift or Java, but there's a ton of everyday plugins that can bring in some native goodness into your project really easily. And these can include things like social sharing, maps like Google Maps or Mapbox, page transitions, animations, progress indicators for loading states, action sheets for multiple choice options, just all things that you would otherwise have to reproduce with a JavaScript library or CSS or custom code. And there are more than just workflow benefits to mixing in native plugins and functionality. With every bit of native functionality you can include in your app, you can think of it as an opportunity to offer a more familiar and integrated experience for the user. Next, I want to talk about reclaiming your code and developing your app's code outside of your PhoneGap project. Moving all app-specific code living in the www folder of your PhoneGap project to a folder outside of the project can give you countless benefits. I mean, a few of them being, it keeps your code separate. So it lets you work on your code in its own directory, and here you're free to keep all of your development-related assets, such as unminified JavaScripts and style sheets and templates, and dev resources like task runner configs and testing tools. And when you're ready for emulation or device testing, a simple build task can copy over just the files you need back into your PhoneGap's www folder. It also makes using Git a breeze for your project. I mean, PhoneGap generates several directories when building your app, so when attempting to version control your entire PhoneGap project, and without a fine-tuned git ignore configuration, you could wind up with many files that don't necessarily belong under version control. So up to this point, we talked a lot about potential changes in your workflow that can help boost day-to-day productivity, but bringing together all of these tips and tricks is really what's needed to achieve a cohesive workflow. So a build tool can help centralize your new efficiencies and do exactly that. I mean, simply put, build tools such as Grunt or Gulp, they help automate our dev tasks. I mean, this can include code validation, compilation, optimizations, and more. I mean, these tools are fairly painless to implement as well. I mean, here's a quick example of getting up and running with Grunt. I mean, to use Grunt, you just simply need Node.js installed, and if you're using PhoneGap, it's already available to you. Just initialize npm in your apps folder. Simple command of npm init will do the trick. Next, you can just install Grunt with 2 simple commands. And then installing packages is as easy as npm install and specifying the package name. So a file named gruntfile.js placed in the root of your project will contain all of your task definitions. So a basic structure will consist of loading all your packages into Grunt, creating your tasks, and defining groups of tasks that will be available for you to run on the command line. So a foundational list of Grunt tasks that I use is a boilerplate in nearly all of my projects. Comes down to compiling style sheets such as Sass or less style sheets, compiling any templates you might be using like handlebars or mustache, concatenating and minifying JavaScripts into a single optimized file, and beforehand even running code validators on my JavaScript code. minifying your index.html file, which might seem kind of trivial, but you can definitely save some precious kilobytes there. Throwing out any extraneous files and folders from your app as you create and copy the production-ready files back into PhoneGap. You can build your PhoneGap project and get it ready for device and emulator testing, and even launch an emulator in the end. So Grunt can really do all of this for you in just one command. I mean, there are almost no limits to the tasks you can automate. For example, you can run the Grunt watch package to monitor files and run tasks when they're changed. So you can compile style sheets, templates, even run code validators for real-time feedback on your code quality every time you save a file. Adding the pre-process package, you can start using programmatic conditionals in your HTML file. And this can provide a seamless way to load unminified assets when building your app in development versus minified assets when building your app for production, all without having to change any code when it comes time to launch. So it's a very simple package and just requires some basic modifications to your HTML file. You can optimize all your images in your app, which can save a considerable amount of space. In addition, to the ecosystem of available Grunt packages, you can run virtually any shell command from Grunt with the exact package. It's a perfect way to build your PhoneGap app and even launch emulators directly from Grunt. At the end of the day, I think we are our own bottlenecks, but it doesn't really have to be that way. I think empowering yourself to make quick and clear development decisions can keep you prioritized and focused. Implementing good organizational practices, which may seem like a necessary evil, will give you immediate benefits on your app's code base and workflow right from the start of your project. By instilling good production optimization practices and constantly testing on all devices and OS combinations you possibly can, it'll help give you confidence when it comes time to launch your app. So ultimately, I believe we're in the time of technology, especially with web technologies, where tools and resources seem virtually endless. We're only limited by our own self-imposed setbacks. So by creating a recurring evaluation loop for our workflow that helps us identify and improve on lacking areas, I believe we can start to ease the growing pains of the future with our PhoneGap projects. So I'd like to give a quick thanks to my co-founder, Amber, for collaborating with me on these inspiring and creative ideas, and also my sister, Elizabeth, who helped in putting parts of this talk together, but mostly to the people at PhoneGap who've hosted what's already been a really insightful conference for me. So thank you.